Hi class, we're in World Literature B, assignment 4, and as I told you in class, we are going to be reading at least chapters 2 and 3 together. We did read chapter 1 together in class, and these are our answers for our homework for chapter 1. We learned about how babies are made in the Brave New World, and why the babies are made to be twins, what the Volkanovsky process is, and the fact that each baby is conditioned in a certain way to be best suited for the job that they end up getting as an adult. We already started in class reading chapter 2, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to start chapter 2 over again, so you can always fast forward the video if you've already listened to parts of it. We are going to be answering the questions as we go. Just for chapters 2 and 3, I'm not going to do the questions for all the chapters, but I do understand that chapters 1, 2, and 3 are the hardest chapters. So I will be spending time on making sure to explain those chapters for you. So we are on chapter 2 of Brave New World. This is on page 19. So please open up your books to page 19 right now. And we're going on a tour of the what does DHC stand for? We got to go back to chapter 1 to see what that stands for. But we're getting a tour of the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center. And the motto of the World State, we call it the Brave New World, but it's called the World State, is community, identity, and stability. The identity part is kind of ironic to me since they're all bred to look alike and act a certain way. So how do you have an individual identity in that community? The things that they value in this world state is sameness, is working and productivity, but not parents and not individuality. Mr. Foster was left in the decanting room. The DHC and his students, this is the director of, it's the director of maybe the Hatchery Center, the DHC. And so remember, Mr. Foster is a worker there, and then the director are taking students around to look at and learn about this Hatchery Center because they're probably going to end up working there. So Mr. Foster was left in the decanting room. The DHC and his students stepped into the nearest lift and were carried up to the 5th floor. Infant nurseries, neo-pavilion conditioning rooms, announced the notice board. So this is how the infants, we already learned how they are born in test tubes, the babies, and well, I guess they're developed in test tubes. And now we're going to learn how they're treated as babies because you know they don't have parents, so they have to be raised by people in this conditioning center. The director opened a door. They were in a large bare room, very bright and sunny, for the whole of the southern wall was a single window. Half a dozen nurses, trousered and jacketed in the regulation white viscose linen uniform, their hair auspiciously hidden under white caps, were engaged in setting out bowls of roses in a long row across the floor. Big bowls packed tight with blossom, thousands of petals, ripe, blown, and silkily smooth, like the cheeks of innumerable little cherubs. But the cherubs, in that bright light, not exclusively pink and Aryan, but also luminously Chinese, also Mexican, also apoplectic, with too much blowing of celestial triumphs, also pale as death, pale with the posthumous whiteness of marble. So there's just roses of all different colors across the room. The nurses stiffened to attention as the DHC came in. "Set out the books," he said curtly. In silence, the nurses obeyed his command. Between the rose bowls, the books were duly set out. A row of nursery quartos opened invitingly, each at some gaily colored image of beast or fish or bird. "Now bring in the children." They hurried out of the room and returned in a minute or two, each pushing a kind of tall dumb waiter laden on all its 4 wire-netted shelves with 8-month-old babies, all exactly alike. A Volkanovsky group, it was evident. Remember, so they all look like twins, basically. And all, since their caste was Delta, dressed in khaki. So this is the first that we learn that the different castes, the different groups of babies, are dressed in different types of clothes. "Put them down on the floor." The infants were unloaded. "Now turn them so they can see the flowers and books." Turned, the babies at once fell silent. They then began to crawl towards those clusters of sleek colors, those shapes so gay and brilliant on the white pages. So they're talking about the pictures of the books. The babies went straight to those pictures. As they approached, the sun came out of a momentary eclipse behind a cloud. The roses flamed up as though with a sudden passion from within. A new and profound significance seemed to suffuse the shining pages of the books. From the ranks of the crawling babies came little squeaks of excitement, gurgles and twitterings of pleasure. The director rubbed his hands. "Excellent," he said. "It might almost have been done on purpose." So he's talking about the sun that just happened to come in at that moment and shine on the roses and the books, making them even more appealing to the babies. The swiftest crawlers were already at their goal. Small hands reached out uncertainly, touched, grasped, unpetaling the transfigured roses, crumpling the illuminated pages of the books. The director waited until all were happily busy. Then, "Watch carefully," he said, and lifting his hand, he gave the signal. The head nurse, who was standing by a switchboard at the other end of the room, pressed down a little lever. There was a violent explosion. Shriller and ever shriller, a siren shrieked. Alarm bells maddeningly sounded. The children started, screamed. Their faces were distorted with terror. "And now," the director shouted, for the noise was deafening, "now we proceed to rub in the lesson with a mild electric shock." He waved his hand again, and the head nurse pressed a second lever. The screaming of the babies suddenly changed its tone. There was something desperate, almost insane about the sharp, spasmodic yelps to which they now gave utterance. Their little bodies twitched and stiffened. Their limbs moved jerkily as if to the tug of unseen wires. "We can electrify that whole strip of floor," bawled the director in explanation. "But that's enough," he signaled to the nurse. The explosion ceased. The bells stopped ringing. The shriek of the siren died down from tone to tone into silence. The stiffly twitching bodies relaxed, and what had become the sob and yelp of infant maniacs broadened out once more into a normal howl of ordinary terror. "Offer them the flowers and the books again." The nurses obeyed, but at the approach of the roses, at the mere sight of those gaily colored images of Pussy and Cock-a-doodle-doo and Baa-Baa Black-Sheep, the infants shrank away in horror. The volume of their howling suddenly increased. "Observe," said the director triumphantly. "Observe. Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shock." Already in the infant mind these couples were compromisingly linked, and after 200 repetitions of the same or a similar lesson would be wedded indissolubly. What man has joined, nature is powerless to put asunder. They'll grow up with what the psychologists used to call an instinctive hatred of books and flowers, reflexes unalterably conditioned. They'll be safe from books and botany all their lives. The director turned to his nurses. Take them away again. Still yelling, the khaki babies were loaded onto their dumbwaiters and wheeled out, leaving behind them the smell of sour milk and a most welcome silence. One of the students held up his hand, and though he could see quite well why you couldn't have lower caste people wasting the community's time over books, and that there was always the risk of their reading something which might undesirably decondition one of their reflexes, yet, well, he couldn't understand about the flowers. Why go to the trouble of making it psychologically impossible for deltas to like flowers? So I would stop here and note this part of the page. Please notice that I'm using a pencil to make any marks in my book, and I'm trying to just make my marks on the side and not underneath the words, because it's a lot easier to erase when it's on the side. When it is underneath words, then when you try to erase it, it ends up erasing the words. So I can't help but to make notes in books. So I know it's really bad, but I feel like as long as you write in pencil only and you make sure your lines are very, very light, and then before you turn in the book to erase the lines, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Probably shouldn't be recording this, that I'm saying this, but that's how I feel. You can also always use a Post-it note. So I have a Post-it note right here. That one has a note on it. But you can also take out a Post-it note. If your Post-it note is too big, then you could always like rip it and put a little note like, okay, this is something important right here. And sometimes when I make a note too, I'll like put an arrow to where it is that I'm the quote that I'm trying to note. And sometimes too, when I use a Post-it note, this is a good spot for me to write down some additional information of why this is an important quote. So, why condition the babies? So this is the question that this answers. So this quote, the reason why I felt this quote was important was because it shows why they had to punish the babies for looking at books, because reading books, it wastes the community's time, because the people, the members of the community aren't being productive, they're not working, they're not helping towards a productive end. And then the also reading could decondition one of their reflexes. So if they read and then they learn, you know, maybe flowers are good through their reading, then all of a sudden it will decondition this hatred of flowers. But the person speaking this doesn't understand why deltas cannot like flowers. Patiently, the DHC explained, if the children were made to scream at the sight of a road, that was on grounds of high economic policy. Not so very long ago, a century or thereabouts, gammas, deltas, even epsilons had been conditioned to like flowers. Okay, so I just want to remind you of the ranks. So alpha is the highest caste and the smartest. They are allowed to keep all their intelligence. Betas are the second highest, and then gammas, deltas, and epsilons, you have the third, fourth, and fifth. So epsilons are the lowest caste, deltas second lowest, gammas third lowest. So gammas, deltas, even epsilons had been conditioned to like flowers. Flowers in particular, and wild nature in general. The idea was to make them want to be going out into the country at every available opportunity, and so compel them to consume transport. So the idea is if they liked flowers, then you'd have more people traveling, and that helps the economy, because when you have people traveling, then you have people spending money on their travels. So they actually wanted them to travel. But the problem was, and didn't they consume transport? Asked the student. Quite a lot, the DHC replied, but nothing else. Primroses and landscapes, he pointed out, have one grave defect. They are gratuitous. A love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to abolish the love of nature at any rate among the lower classes, to abolish the love of nature, but not the tendency to consume transport. So this is, I think, an important quote. They had to abolish the love of nature from their society. For, of course, it was essential that they should keep on going to the country, even though they hated it. The problem was to find an economically sounder reason for consuming transport than a mere affection for primroses and landscapes. It was duly found. We condition the masses to hate the country, concluded the director, but simultaneously we condition them to love all country sports. At the same time, we see to it that all country sports shall entail the use of elaborate apparatus, so that they consume manufactured articles as well as transport, hence those electric shocks. Okay, that is where we have the first two questions. Now the first question was already answered in class. So what is the purpose of conditioning the Delta babies to be afraid of books and roses? Well, we wrote Delta babies were conditioned to be afraid of books and roses so they wouldn't waste productive time on them. Books could also decondition them, so take away their conditioning, their learning. Now the second question is, why is it necessary for the masses to consume transport and other products? Does efficiency of production lead to oversupply? Oh, see, that part didn't really talk about. But the masses needed to not only want to work, but also want to consume and purchase goods, services, travel, events. So we're seeing this right now during COVID time. When you have everyone locked at their house, you don't have people going out to eat. You don't have people shopping in downtown markets. You don't have people traveling and using and spending time in hotels and eating at restaurants in new cities and buying souvenirs and like going to concerts and, you know, all of those things that people spend money on. You don't have it anymore if everyone is working. So if people are just working, then there's nothing for anyone to buy or purchase. So why would we produce these goods for people to buy, like sports equipment, if no one wants to play sports and no one cares about sports equipment? Then it's like, well, then that whole industry is pointless. So there needs to be conditioning for people to not only enjoy work, but also to want to spend money on the products that these people are working towards making. Okay. So next question is about Henry Ford, and we're not going to get to that for a while. So we're on page 23. So I'm just going to read without stopping for a while. And well, I'll try. I'll probably stop and explain something. Okay. I see, said the students, and was silent, lost in admiration. There was a silence, then clearing his throat. Once upon a time, the director began, while our Ford was still on earth, there was a little boy called Reuben Rabinovich. Reuben was the child of Polish-speaking parents. The director interrupted himself. You know what Polish is, I suppose. So, Remember when I told you in class that this whole book is based off of the Model T Henry Ford car assembly line? And it's as if the humans were like, it's looking at the future, imagining what life would be like if humans were created on an assembly line, like cars were. And so in this society, our Ford um, is referring to Henry Ford. And Henry Ford is kind of like a god to this society, and everyone worships this man. And so Reuben Rabinovich was a person who lived when Ford was still alive. So it was a really long time ago, in the 1920s. The director interrupted himself. Oh, sorry. Reuben was the child of Polish-speaking parents. The director interrupted himself. You know what Polish is, I suppose. A dead language. Like French and German, added another student, officiously showing off his learning. And parent? Questioned the DHC. There was an uneasy silence. Several of the boys blushed and had not yet learned to draw the significance, but often very fine distinction between smut and pure science. One at last had the courage to raise a hand. Human beings used to be, he hesitated. The blood rushed to his cheeks. Well, they used to be viviparous. So I paused recording there so I could learn how to say this word. The way that you say it is viviparous, and I just looked it up, and it's a biological term to refer to animals that have their babies grow inside of them. So there's some animals that have their babies grow in an egg, and there's some animals that have their babies grow inside of them, and then you have some animals like marsupials whose baby grows in a pouch. So viviparous just means that you have your baby is grown inside of a parent's womb. Now, that's not how babies are grown in Brave New World, in the world state. Instead, they're grown in a test tube. So this idea of having parents, it kind of disgusts them, and they're conditioned to feel disgust over having parents or being parent, so that they don't long for parents, and so that's not something that they miss, and it's not something that they feel like they missed out on. So the idea of a parent and having children of your own, they're conditioned to find that to be gross and scandalous and something that you just don't talk about. So they're talking about the scientific way of saying it because they're like, this is embarrassing. We don't talk about having parents. Ew, it's just a way different way of thinking. Quite right, the director nodded approvingly. And when the babies were decanted, born, came the correction. Well, then they were the parents. I mean, not the babies, of course, the other ones. The poor boy was overwhelmed with confusion. In brief, the director summed up, the parents were the father and the mother. The smut, that was really science. So smut kind of is talking about like inappropriate speech. The smut that was really science fell with a crash into the boy's eye-avoiding silence. Mother, he repeated loudly, rubbing in the science, and leaning back in his chair. These, he said gravely, are unpleasant facts. I know it, but then most historical facts are unpleasant. He returned to little Reuben, in whose room one evening, by an oversight, his father and mother, crash, crash, happened to leave the radio turned on. For you must remember that in those days of gross viviparous reproduction, children were always brought up by their parents and not in state conditioning centers. So he says gross viviparous. So having your parents like rear you is considered gross to them. While the child was asleep, a broadcast program from London suddenly started to come through, and the next morning, to the astonishment of his crash and crash, the more daring of the boys ventured to grin at one another. Little Reuben woke up repeating word for word a long lecture by that curious old writer, one of the very few whose works have been permitted to come down to us, George Bernard Shaw, who was speaking, according to a well-authenticated tradition, about his own genius. To little Reuben's wink and snigger, this lecture was, of course, perfectly incomprehensible, and imagining that their child had suddenly gone mad, they sent for a doctor. Oh, you know what I just realized? Is when they say crash, crash, they're talking, it's every time he mentions father and mother. So, and then where it says, to Reuben's wink and snigger, so mother and father. So instead of actually saying the words mother and father, he didn't say the words and just repeated of his crash, crash. So instead of saying mother and father, because those were like scandalous words. See, I told you this is hard to understand because it goes from the guy talking to the narration, but the narration is actually the guy talking. Okay. To little Reuben's wink and snigger, Mom and Dad, this lecture was, of course, perfectly incomprehensible, and imagining that their child had suddenly gone mad, they sent for a doctor. He, fortunately, understood English, recognized the discourse as to which Shaw had broadcasted the previous evening, realized the significance of what had happened, and sent a letter to the medical press about it. The principle of sleep training, or hypnopedia, had been discovered. The DHC made an impressive pause. The principle had been discovered, but many, many years were to elapse before the principle was usefully applied. The case of little Reuben occurred only 23 years after R. Ford's first Model T was put on the market. Here the director made a sign of the T on his stomach, and all the students reverently followed suit. So it seems like every time they mention Ford, they do a symbol of a T. And yet, and like people do a symbol of a cross now, you know, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Well, they do the symbol of the T for Ford and Model T. And yet, furiously, the students scribbled, Hypnopedia first used officially in AF 214. Why not before? 2 reasons. A, these early experiments, the DHC was saying, were on the wrong track. They thought that hypnopedia could be an instrument of intellectual education. A small boy asleep on his right side, the right arm stuck out, the right hand hanging limp over the edge of the bed. Through a round grating in the side of a box, a voice speaks softly. The Nile is the longest river in Africa, and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe. Although falling short of the length of the Mississippi, Missouri, the Nile is at the head of all rivers as regards the length of its basin, which extends through 35 degrees of latitude. At breakfast the next morning, someone says, do you know which is the longest river in Africa? A shaking of the head. Don't you remember something that begins, the Nile is the longest river in Africa and the second in length of all the rivers of the globe. The words come rushing out. Although falling short of, well now, which is the longest river in Africa? The eyes are blank. I don't know. But the Nile, Tommy. The Nile is the longest river in Africa and second. Then which river is the longest, Tommy? Tommy bursts into tears. I don't know, he howls. That howl, the director made it plain, discouraged the earliest investigators. The experiments were abandoned. No further attempt was made to teach children the length of the Nile in their sleep. Quite rightly, you can't learn a science unless you know what it's all about. Whereas, if they'd only started on moral education, said the director, leading the way towards the door. The students followed him. desperately scribbling as they walked all the way up in the lift. Moral education, which ought never, in any circumstances, to be rational. Silence, silence, whispered a loudspeaker as they stepped out at the 14th floor, and silence, silence, the trumpet mouse indefatigably repeated at intervals down every corridor. The students and even the director himself rose automatically to the tips of their toes. They were alphas, of course, but even alphas have been well conditioned. Silence, silence. All the air of the 14th floor was sibilant with the categorical imperative. 50 yards of tiptoeing brought them to a door which the director cautiously opened. They stepped over the threshold into the twilight of a shuttered dormitory. 80 cots stood in a row against the wall. There was a sound of light, regular breathing in a continuous murmur, as of very faint voices remotely whispering. A nurse rose as they entered and came to attention before the director. "What's the lesson this afternoon?" he asked. "We had elementary sex for the first 40 minutes," she answered, "but now it's switched over to elementary class consciousness." The director walked slowly down the long line of cots. Rosy and relaxed with sleep, 80 little boys and girls lay softly breathing. There was a whisper under every pillow. The DHC halted and, bending over one of the little beds, listened attentively. Elementary class consciousness, did you say? Let's have it repeated a little louder by the trumpet. At the end of the room, a loudspeaker projected from the wall. The director walked up to it and pressed a switch. "All wear green," said a soft but very distinct voice, beginning in the middle of a sentence, "and Delta children wear khaki." "Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children. And Epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such a beastly color. I'm so glad I'm a beta." There was a pause, then the voice began again. "Alpha children wear gray. They work much harder than we do, because they're so frightfully clever. I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta, because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green, and delta children wear khaki. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children, and epsilons are still worse. They're too stupid to be able." The director pushed back the switch. The voice was silent. Only its thin ghost continued to mutter from beneath the 80 pillows. "They'll have that repeated 40 to 50 times more before they wake. Then again on Thursday, and again on Saturday, 120 times, 3 times a week for 30 months, after which they go on to a more advanced lesson. Roses and electric shocks, the khaki of deltas, and a whiff of asphotia, wedded indissolubly before the child can speak. But wordless conditioning is crude and wholesale, cannot bring home the finer distinctions, cannot inoculate the more complex courses of behavior. For that there must be words, but words without reason. In brief, hypnopedia, the greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time. The students took it down in their little books, straight from the horse's mouth. Once more the director touched the switch. "So frightfully clever," the soft, insinuating, indefatigable voice was saying. "I'm really awfully glad I'm a beta because, not so much like drops of water. The water, it is true, can wear holes in the hardest granite. Rather, drops of liquid sealing wax, drops that adhere, encrust, incorporate themselves with what they fall on, till finally the rock is all but one scarlet blob. Till at last the child's mind is these suggestions. And the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind. And not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long. The mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions. But all of these suggestions are our suggestions. The director almost shouted in his triumph. Suggestions from the state. He banged the nearest table. It therefore follows. A noise made him turn around. Oh, Ford, he said in another tone, I've gone and woken the children. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Let's spend some time answering these questions, and then I'll stop this Zoom or this recording, and we'll get to chapter 3 next. Why is Henry Ford, who invented assembly line manufacturing, along with the first Ford automobiles, treated almost as a deity in the world state? So a deity is another word for God. So the world state sees Henry Ford as a God-like figure because they modeled their whole world around the idea of the assembly line and production over individuality. So instead of everyone being different, instead, let's make everyone the same, just like the car. Let's make it cheap. Let's make it affordable. Let's make it hardworking. Let's make it dependable. Let's make it something that we can count on, just like a car. So it's like mechanizing human production. Why did early attempts at sleep teaching fail? How did they improve it? So at first, they tried to teach facts and science with sleep training, but then realized that moral and social rules could be taught better that way. So think about the things we are subtly taught as people in this world. We're subtly taught racism. No one directly says you should hate people of the opposite race. Most people don't say that. But you learn racism through the actions of others, and you subtly learn it over time. Well, in this society, they subtly teach bias. They subtly teach those social rules and morals through sleep training. So not so subtly, but everyone is just told, this is how you should think. This is how you should feel. And they're all told the same thing during their sleep over and over again. So then it becomes part of their reality. What is taught in elementary class consciousness? Bias towards their own class, their own classes, and against other classes. Or actually, I should call them casts, because that's what they call them, is taught. So the difference between a cast and a class is that a cast is something you're born into and you can't get out of it, but a class has to do with how much money you have and how much money you make. So with a class, people can make more money and change it. So that's why cast is a better word for this. Do we have a similar course in our educational system? Do we have a course called Elementary Class Consciousness? Not directly, but students are taught right from wrong. Would it be a good idea? So would it be a good idea to learn biasness? I would say no, it would not be a good idea unless the purpose of the class is to create more open-mindedness. It's a big word, but that's a word. So no, it would, I think personally, and you can always change your answer to a different answer, but I think it would not be a good idea unless the purpose of the class is to create more open-mindedness instead of, I want to put exacerbate, but I think that word's too big, instead of highlighting bias against groups of people. So the sleep training, this elementary class consciousness, seems to create a bias against groups of people. So you shouldn't like alphas because you're a beta. You shouldn't like gammas and deltas and epsilons because they're stupid and they're dumb. You should like being a beta. Like, that doesn't seem like a good thing to teach kids, right? Like, oh, let's hate these kids. Like, let's hate other kids because of how they were raised. Maybe not the best idea. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. We'll do the next video for chapter 3. See you on the flip side.